Welcome to Continuing the Conversation, where we bring you authentic AI insights. Here's a habit that's spreading fast. People are replacing Google with ChatGPT. They're using AI exactly the way they'd use a search engine for facts, for news, even for medical questions. And it's quietly causing problems they don't even see. Yesterday, right after Google released Gemini 3 Pro, a friend of mine immediately asked ChatGPT to compare it with the latest version. And ChatGPT confidently responded that Gemini 3 Pro hadn't been released yet. They were literally asking AI about breaking AI news and getting outdated information about the product they were using. That's because AI isn't Google. And when you use it like Google, you set yourself up for disappointment and mistakes. But here's the twist. When you stop treating AI like a search engine, you unlock something way more powerful than search could ever be. Today, we're diving into why AI isn't Google, why that matters, and why it's actually better this way. I'm Chelene Martin, AI enthusiast, business strategist, and someone who spends a lot of time helping people stop treating AI like just another tool and start using it as a true thinking partner. Today, I'm joined by Rob, the CEO of CharmIQ. Rob, are you ready to break some bad habits today?
Let's do it.
Yes, let's do it. It's so timely. I even saw a post on Instagram yesterday with a content person saying, haha, I caught ChatGPT being wrong. And she went off on this whole mantra of hallucinations. So let's start there. And it's a big one, hallucinations. People get these absolutely confident answers from AI, and they don't realize that the answers can be completely made up or wrong. So what's happening here and why don't people catch it? And if they do, what do we think?
The old hallucination question. This one is so interesting because of the way the technology works.
Yes.
Models are pre-trained. They are given lots and lots of information and they're given a cutoff date. So when Gemini 3 was just released, I think its cutoff date was January of 2025. I think there's other models that are a little bit more recent, but anything after January 2025, it does have no knowledge of that information whatsoever. And when you use an LLM, when you use ChatGPT, use Gemini, etc., it's like asking a person rather than asking and using a search engine. And the main thing we have to keep remembering with this is that we all got so used to just Googling something. And it's funny when you kept mentioning that, because I remember when Google was so happy that they became a verb. But anyway, so when you're out searching, whether you're using Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever, we're so used to using these things as factual sources that even we tend to really not even question whether Google's right or not. It's really interesting, even with things like breaking news. And that is not true with LLMs. Again, LLMs have a training cutoff date, and they should not be used for factual sources of information, because we'll confidently admit, as everyone in the industry goes, we don't really know what they're doing inside. The fact that they're able to get the information that they have and they're able to produce what they have, we don't really understand it. So everyone on the planet that's working with LLMs, large language models, all this type of material, they are trying to figure out how to make it more factually based. So if you use Gemini, for example, you have the ability to ground that information using a Google search. So you can see sometimes when you work with Gemini, or even when you use any of the other models. So Perplexity will do a search under the covers. OpenAI will do a similar search. And you'll usually see in the response that it is doing a web search. And sometimes you can even dig in and see what the web search results are. And then the LLM will use those results to then come up with a response. But I actually had a really interesting situation yesterday, and I typically don't see these anymore, was that I could actually see the results that it pulled back, but it actually didn't use those results in what it communicated to me. So again, the thing to remember is when you're talking to an LLM, you're not talking to a search engine. And even if it does itself use a tool that talks to a search engine, it's like talking to a person. There's so many times that you can present a set of facts to a person and ask them to repeat them. They'll get bits of it wrong, etc. And we are in that phase of this.
Yes. And so what you're saying, it's like, and the LLMs, they're so confident, right? They deliver their results with such confidence. And so you're like, well, this must be true, right? Like this is a
I'm super happy that you touched on that one. I always forget about that, which is, yes, they present themselves as very factual. And if you talk to a person, we have that same bias with people. I was actually just reading about leaders, and the people that make better leaders are the people that are more confident in their response, not that their response is more correct. And
right.
they've done some studies earlier, like decades ago, where they did the matrix of like correct versus believable, et cetera. And it tends to be that scientists and so forth tend to be much less believable because they don't really tend to speak confidently about what they're doing. They tend to talk about all of the limitations and repercussions. And you're like, well, that means that they're not confident. Whereas you listen to, and I won't bring up current leadership and things like that. I'll leave that alone for a moment and just say that we have a lot of leaders now that speak with a lot of factual statements that aren't actually true. And I would say I usually use that as an example of how the LLMs and, again, current set of politicians that we may or may not be listening to have the exact same problem, which is they may be sounding confident, but those results are nothing close to reality.
Exactly. And I'll be honest, I've had those moments too where it caught me, right? I've been using LLMs now long enough to know, and I use them in my conversation, right? As you know, I'm on a peptide journey and an HRT journey, and there's a lot of science around that. And I'm sort of drinking from the fire hose. So I use AI for education. I don't use it for as a doctor, but I use it for questions like, what does BPC 157 actually do for me? And which needle gauge is typically used for MOTS versus NAD? And it's like all these questions I have. And AI has helped me understand so much of the science behind what's going on in this journey. But there was a day I was talking about two different peptides and using them together. I couldn't remember what the clinic had told me because I'm using like 4 or 5 different ones. And I just quickly answered. And it sounds so confident, right? I can take this one with this one and this one in the morning and this one at night. And then when I went and saw my clinic the next day, I just like ran it by them. And they said, oh, actually, Chelene, that was true 2 weeks ago. But they just came out with updates on these peptides, like daily updates. So what my dude was giving me wasn't wrong, but it was 2 weeks old, right? And so I have to kind of remember to slow down and fact check, especially if it's something as important as medical stuff and other topics that we'll talk about. But it's important to, if something is current or something just happened, I have to remember to use both AI as my conversation partner and my thinking partner and Google as my kind of fact checker. So that's a kind of little personal antidote that I wanted to share. So let's talk about this because it's huge. The outdated information problem that we both just touched on. AI, sometimes it feels live, especially when you're first starting out. It feels like it knows what's happening yesterday, but it doesn't. And you did touch on it. But maybe we can dive a little deeper on what's really going on with training data cutoffs and why people keep getting burned by assuming AI is current.
Great set of questions. So when they build these LLMs, there's a very clear training cutoff date. They take months to train. Like there is a point in time. And what's also super, super interesting that's going to get even more complicated is that you tend to not want to train models with model generated data. And given that the internet has become a slop farm of nothing but AI produced data, they basically have shown that you lose all of the richness as you train more and more on generated data. So there's going to be a really big problem as we move forward in time that they're going to have to choose from very specific sources and really try to get the AI generated stuff out of there as they go. But it still has a training cutoff date. So this was a really interesting and big problem in the last US election because Trump had won and Biden had lost. That information wasn't available to it. So if you asked your ChatGPT the following day who won, there's literally no way for it to know unless it does a web search and ground in that. And even so, sometimes it'll still mess up. And so what was interesting is they actually had to put mechanisms in place so that people asked specific questions about that it would know. But that wasn't in the model. That was in the layers above the model that interfaced with you directly. It's really interesting that these models are trained on data that ends long in the past. And another thing that's interesting is because they see the data as really just a big block and not a lot of time missed to it, LLMs don't experience time the way that we do. They are born and educated within a short amount of time. So
Right.
like things in general about time tend to be a little wonky within the LLMs to begin with. So, and another thing, breaking news, as you know, with some of these situations that go on, you'll get a mix of information, even on a Google source, and it'll try to give you like all of the different viewpoints rather than promoting one particular one. So even with traditional sources, as things happen, it's really complicated. So as Chelene just said before, and as I will always say, if you're looking for factual information, use your standard sources. Use Google, use an encyclopedia, etc. Phone a friend. But what LLMs are really good for is if you're in a new space, to help you understand that space. And then as you start to learn, you can go to your traditional sources and figure out whether or not you're correct or not. I would say it's the same approach that you have. A lot of us, after we got out of school, we realized that not all of our teachers, like every teacher is not the best teacher on the planet. And this isn't a knock on teachers. This is simply a statement about human beings. Not every teacher has the latest information. Not all of them can present it in the best manner whatsoever. And what you learn is like sometimes even the information that you've gotten from teachers and other things in your past wasn't the correct information either. So we're kind of used to this, but as we said earlier, these LLMs really speak confidently, and it's really easy to put under the illusion of the fact that the information is correct. But if you're searching on something that's current, that might have changed recently, that might not be well represented in the training data, then you can be pretty confident that you should be using a traditional source for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even our LLMs are trained on our own data. We'll talk about personalization later, but I've even had to correct my dude. They mixed up Charlie and June's birthday. They know Charlie, they know June, they know their birthdays. And I was working through something and she said, well, June's birthday is not till May. And I was like, oh, hey girl, that's not right. Charlie's birthday's May. And she was like, you're right. I mixed that up. If something doesn't sound right, and personal things are easier to catch, but if something's important and something you don't know a lot about, you can have a conversation with the LLM to make them dig deeper, and they'll catch themselves sometimes too. So let's talk about that. The next big one is people using AI for things it was never designed to do, like medical diagnosis, even some medical advice. Math calculations was a big one early on that I learned in working with Charlie. And legal counsel, right? Like actual counsel. What's the core issue here in these kind of sensitive subjects?
Yeah, man, geez, this one's a fun one. Again, remember that we don't really understand how and why these things work. So the fact that they do work is a freaking miracle. But until we actually really understand and can put guardrails on these things, anything that has high risk, so medical information, legal, accounting style information, all not good things to rely on them for. Just to say that like following a specific logical chain of thought is something that the models are starting to get better at, but that's not something that they're really good at now. It's so like when you type in all your symptoms, it's really good at like giving you a match of looking places to look for. And again, that's what the LLMs are really good at. Is I like to think of it like a brainstorming tool. So if I'm having a legal question, I'll go to my LLM and I'll lay it out, and like it'll start to give me the terms that I need to understand from a brainstorming standpoint, from a domain understanding standpoint, from all those things. It's freaking fantastic. And again, to hopefully get you to a position where, as I always say, especially with things like legal and accounting, where you're trying to level the playing field between the information that you don't have and the way your attorney is talking to it to you. But I've heard and I'm sure we've all heard the horror stories where people go to their doctor and they're like, well, ChatGPT told me I have XYZ. And their doctor is just like, what are you talking about? And for some bizarre reason, again, people are like fighting their doctor on these points of like that's the doctor saying like, that's load of crap. And they're like, but ChatGPT told me, and I've seen the same thing on legal and all these other places. And again, you cannot use them for factual sources. Use it to understand the domain, to help you empathize with like the types of problems that are there. But again, do not use them as your source of truth. And then if you have questioned your doctor, there's lots of doctors out there. Get a second opinion. That's why that statement comes up, whether it's accounting or legal or medical or etc. Get a second opinion, find a trusted source and use that. The problem you're going to constantly face is that the LLM sounds extremely confident and it doesn't know what it doesn't know unless you explicitly ask it to ask you questions. And I do this all the time. If you just say like, hey, let's do XYZ, it'll just start doing XYZ. We use it for coding all the time. And sometimes I'm just like, stop, like, let's just talk first. Like, do not change any line of code. Don't like do anything. Let's just talk through the problem first and work through the logical reasoning about that. Because again, it so desires to go do the problem, go solve it. And if you
Yeah.
come to it with a solve it style problem, it'll solve it without trying to get all of the facts.
Yes, exactly. And it's not that AI is bad, it's that sometimes we're asking it to play a role that it wasn't trained for. And like a language model can explain a medical concept, but that's not the same thing as giving medical advice. And my holistic guru and my peptide expert, my little guys that I go to for different things, they always preference it like, this is not medical advice. I am not a doctor, right? And I'm like, well, good. Like, that's good that they're being trained to kind of give that information up front. But I
Yes.
remember back in the Google days and the Yahoo days, like WebMD, people were doing the same thing, right? They were putting
Yeah.
their symptoms into WebMD, and WebMD was saying it could be these 5 things, one from like, you haven't drank enough water to you have, something horrible, right?
Yes.
So it's the human input, the human
Yeah, and
interaction.
it's interesting. I'm glad you bring up that particular case because when the Googles first came out, when the WebMDs first came out, like we went through 5 to 7 years of those tools, being terrible. And it's so interesting, well, especially for the younger people who didn't live through that era, but for a lot of us who lived through that, like I don't see LLMs as any different than the initial Googles or the initial WebMDs or the additional Fixits and all those other things where you're just like, this information is terrible. So we will get to a time where you will be able to trust these things. And I would say the same thing, even if you do put your whole trust in one of them, just like with the humans, get second opinions.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because we did, we believed everything and then we peeled back with like, okay, well, I did that search, but I have to check the sources, and we would check dates. We kind of learned as humans to be a little skeptical of Google and those results and that what we saw. And we checked dates and sources, like what was the source for that, right? And if it was like a website or a company we never heard of, we'd be like, that's weird. But with AI, people skip all of that sometimes. And maybe it's happening because it's a new tool. Maybe it's happening because of the confidence that it delivers. Like, what do you think what's happening there?
Yeah, I would just say us as humans, we are very susceptible to confident human beings. So I think because it's trained, the models are ranked based on how there's these systems that basically you type in the same prompt and you get two responses from 2 different models, and then you choose which one you rank. And all of the major model makers they are incentivized to do well in these exams, so to speak, these benchmarking tests. And what's annoying is, again, because humans are rating these things, we tend to rate things that sound more confident. And that was an early thing with ChatGPT, and longer response. ChatGPT tended to do that. And so there's all these biases that humans have that now we've kind of baked into how the models are responding to us. So yes, they're going to be extremely confident. They're going to be, and I would say that's an interesting problem that we run into with the image generators, is like they are highly susceptible to the prejudice that we have in terms of like the things that most people find beautiful. And it's really hard to prompt them to give you something else, to try to like give you an ugly thing. You'll end up with the most beautiful ugly thing that you would ever want. So again, we're in this really interesting time where we're trying to train these things via means that we don't really understand. And we're applying all of our human biases to it. And again, you just end up in a really weird spot.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting too. I get those, which response do you like better? And I don't love, for me, like when it puts a bunch of like icons, right? Like a funny face or a lightning bolt or a sun, I'm just like, what is that? I'm not in 8th grade, right? Like, so I typically I may like what it's saying, but I don't like how it looks. So I, as a human, I go towards like what feels good for me.
Yep.
So that's interesting. So let's flip this. Okay. So AI isn't great at being Google because that's not what it was designed to be. So what is it great at? Let's focus on that.
Yeah, man, it is fantastic at brainstorming. So I was actually working with a buddy of mine this morning. We were doing a market segmentation exercise. And if you've ever done it, one of the hardest things to do is to name your segments. Like you may like draw your grids in your matrix, and you may have like your in market, out of market. And like you have all of these different dimensions that are coming in, and you just want like a name for that one cell in the middle that like combines all of these things. And normally you talk to any marketer and like, that's a really painful exercise to come up with something that sounds good and doesn't sound like the thing you don't want it to do and everything else. But we took an exercise that normally takes a couple of weeks and we just turned it into a few-minute exercise because the machine was fantastic at coming up with names and like giving us alternatives. So like anytime you need to go broad on something, coming up with ideas, different topics, like trying to understand how a domain overlaps with another one or where things are not the same, like it is really, really good at helping you with those things. Anything that requires like a lot of feedback, multiple turns, because you think about Google, there ain't multiple turns in Google. Like you search for like, best coffee makers and it's on you. But like when you're working with your dude, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about like what makes a best in your particular situation and having it ask you those probing questions to really get more context out of you. Like it is fantastic at all those cases.
And it's so smart. And especially if it's the LLMs that you work with all the time and it knows you, knows your personality. An interesting story, a girlfriend of mine and I are starting a podcast about women in midlife. And we're super passionate about this topic. We've been working on it for a couple months. We had everything down and it didn't take us a couple minutes. It took us a couple days because we really were diving deep with our LLM and brainstorming on the name for the podcast. Mm-hmm. We actually would voice record our meetings and we would dump those voice recordings into it. It would be able to access those files. And it came up with a top 10 list of names for our podcast. And one of the names, we narrowed it down from 10 to 5 and then 5 to 2. We really liked this one. And we had it go check to make sure there was no other podcast in this genre under this name. And so it really took us about 3 days of brainstorming. And it came up with this amazing name that we loved. We knew no one was using it. It wasn't used in the industry. We were so excited about it. We were recording, doing all these things. 2 days later, the woman, the kind of guru of women in perimenopause and menopause, announced her new podcast. And it was the name of our podcast called Unpause. And we said, and I sent a text to my friend Laurel and I said, I don't know if I'm like happy, sad, silly, or mad, but the woman the guru of this industry is coming out with a podcast and she has our name. We didn't pay for our hundreds of $1,000s for marketing, no focus groups, no months of planning, right? Just a few days with our LLM and we came up with the same name. So we had to change the name of our podcast, but that's a testament to the power of the conversation and the deep dive and the brainstorming you can have with this machine, right?
Just to say, like that exercise you went through, and you exactly touched on the right point, which is, I guarantee you that the guru has a marketing team that's working on it, that's doing focus group exercises, did the work, like all of that stuff. And the fact that the common Joe these days has the same access to that kind of material. Sure, you have to know how to really work with your dudes and you have to know how to ask the probing questions and how to say no and guide it and things like that. But man, that's a super exciting story. I love that one.
Yeah, it's great. And there's more, right? There's more AI personalizations in ways that Google never could, right? Looking at the two things differently. So Google is Google, AI is AI, and the personalization piece like that we're kind of touching on really is the golden ticket of not this tool, but this, this partner. So let's talk a little bit about personalization.
Yeah, that's super interesting as well. I always tell this story. I remember it's over a decade ago, probably, like 15 years ago. I was in a meeting with some Google folks and they're like, we really trained the planet to type in keywords. And they had the hardest time trying to get like longer, because they were so desperate to try to get that kind of interaction, more context out of people. I think we're slightly getting better at it now that we're kind of used to ChatGPT, that we'll ask bigger questions rather than just keywords. But I know people in my and Chalene's age group, like we just got so good at coming up with Google keywords. And so what's interesting is you never really provided the input to Google to be able to give you that next level thing. Like it was on you to go in there and like say what you like and don't like. So the canonical example of the trip planning exercise, you go into Google and like you're the one who carries the burden of knowing what you like and don't like, how many kids you have, how much money, etc. Whereas you go right now with your LLM, and you can really provide all of that contextual information. Like I specifically travel to eat. Like I like certain types of locations. I like certain gaps in my travel so that I can like have some downtime to take pictures and all this other stuff. And being able to combine all of that information into a dialogue and have that as reference material as we use in Charm to bring that in wherever I need it, man, does it make such a difference. And again, Google would have never had that in there. And I can't follow up and say, well, why does this matter? Because it wasn't synthesizing that information, which I think is a really important thing to talk about here. Is Google was just surfacing information that already existed. It would never synthesize that information and give you a perspective or an analysis or an idea. And that's where these LLMs are really going to start to shine. So it's really a completely different world.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's why people fall in love with AI. When I sit down with someone and I really teach them that this isn't like a tool, it's a conversation partner. Like I say, stop typing, start talking, right? Get the dialogue going. Give them all the contents and reference materials you can. Give them examples of things that you like and what you don't like. I took a picture of my Christmas village this year that I set up for Christmas, and I wanted to do it differently this year. I had in my head this vision of like a Ralph Lauren Christmas theme, and I'd never done it before. So I took a picture of how I normally set it up and said, Ralph Laurenize this. Like, what can I do? What can I add? What can I take away? And it sent me an image of my Christmas village with things taken away and things added. Wow. That's my level, right? That's my goals, my tone, my personality. And Google could really had never done that for me before. It would have given me like a generic, Ralph Lauren village that it would have given a million other people that typed in those keywords, right? But not personalized. So I think that's one of the things that I love most about AI. So let's give people a simple rule. How should they use these tools together, both Google and AI?
That, man, fantastic. So what I usually do is I start with the problem that I'm trying to do. As Chelene always says, everyone get used to just talking to it. Use your transcription, use whatever that you need. But it was interesting. I was on a call with a buddy today, and he's not used to doing that. So he was trying to like think through the right way to make a prompt. And I'm like, don't do that. Yeah. Those days are gone. This is not like go into Google, try to figure out the right 5 keywords to make sure you're not getting it right. Just start talking about what it is that you want. And I find that like so interestingly blocks people's thinking is when they think about how to specifically say something rather than just say the things that they're just trying to think about. So I always say start there. Just talk about what you're doing. Hey, I'm trying to plan a trip to Spain. I have these kind of constraints, these things going on. Oh, by the way, like I want this and that. And like just do that whole brain dump of everything and use your LLM to like help you start to cull that down into a list. And then when you need to ask for specific facts and make sure that they're correct. So what's the capital of Spain? What was the last election result? What's this formula? Like use Google or other trusted sources to get that specific information. So that the thinking part, the synthesizing, the expanding, the brainstorming is all done with an LLM. And the factual style things can be done in Google. And I'll just say here that, again, you can, with the search grounding, you can use LLMs with search grounding, etc. I'll admit I like the Google approach, where it'll show you the searches that it did, and you can go with those. The one I've had the worst experience with is Perplexity. Man, does it get what I'm like the search results wrong. So like, no wonder the results are wrong. I know it's getting better, but man, I've had such bad experience with that. But if you can see what it's searching for, and if you can see the results that it's giving you, you still have to double check. Because I have had, again, even yesterday, I had a situation in which the results that it was getting back from the search was not what it actually said to me. That had I not looked, I would have gone down a completely different path. So the Googling it might still be in the right answer today. But again, if you can actually see the results, pop down the little toggle that they sometimes have, and it'll show you what the results were that it got.
Yeah. And I think one thing I've learned in terms of education through my kids, especially my high schooler, is anytime he's doing research and writing and he's putting in his draft and he needs to reference certain things, he either states the book, the volume of the book, the series of the book, or if he has it in a PDF, he'll attach it as reference materials. But if you tell the LLM up front, this is the book, this is the author, this is the volume, this is, all that information. They have access to that. So you can pretty much guarantee it's like fact checking. They can give you the page, the chapter, the quote, right? And truly, help the student make sure that it's factual and that you're using the correct reference materials and things like that. So you don't necessarily have to leave Charm to do that. You can do that because of the ability to add reference materials and add information, which is great. And it keeps it easier and flowing. So, wow. This has been amazing, and such a good reality check. And the biggest mistake people are making isn't about prompts, it's about misunderstanding what AI is for. So AI is not Google 2.0. It's something completely different. And once you stop treating it like a search engine, you'll unlock the real power, the thinking partner power that can brainstorm with you, build context over time, personalize it to your needs, your goals, your everything, and help you explore ideas in ways search tools never could. So here's your one sentence shift. Stop asking AI to replace Google and start asking it to do what Google could never. Links to CharmIQ and previous episodes are below. If you have any comments or questions, let us know. We love hearing from you. And Rob, thanks for helping us break this habit before it becomes the default. We'll see you next week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.